Elijah lived among kings who managed budgets and worried about taxes and were committed to notions of scarcity, were swimming in anxiety about the lack of enough. Into this anxious, fearful scarcity comes Eliyahu, unintimidated by royal power, unencumbered by royal economics of scarcity, uncontrolled by royal protocol. He is sent by God to this woman who, in her despair, is about to starve to death. Eliyahu says to the nameless woman, "Do not be afraid." Imagine saying that to this woman who, with good reason, is about to give up for want of food. His utterance is a startling disruption of despair. And then he puts substance to his disruptive invitation to move beyond fear. The jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth. This is what he said to the settled economy of anxious scarcity. He uttered an absurdity. Eliyahu announced a reliable, God-given abundance to this woman who had nothing and who hoped nothing. Everything in the story is so odd. Eliyahu was sent beyond the boundaries of his ordinary life. He lived in northern Israel, not far from the capital city of Samaria. But he was sent away where he had not thought to go. He went to Sidon, what would now be Lebanon, that dangerous place for Jews, occupied by Arabs who in turn are dominated by Syria. And in Sidon, go to a village that nobody ever heard of, where there are no important people, away from all the media attention. How odd, in post-election exhaustion, where we were called to defend ourselves from an invading caravan of 3,500 or so unarmed men, women, and children seeking asylum in a country of 350 million, that we meet here to talk about a nameless widow from an unknown village in enemy territory. But then the Bible does that sort of thing. The God of Israel is the one, as we sang in Psalm 146, who loves the righteous, who cares for the stranger, and sustains the orphan and the widow. And God judges Israel's behavior by how Israel cares for these same least and lost, those who are marginalized and powerless by society's rules. We find Jesus in the gospel teaching in the temple. Mark tells us he is seated in the temple. Now, inside the Holy of Holies is the seat of mercy. No one but God sits in the temple. So Jesus is teaching with authority. So we are not surprised then to hear Jesus echo God's concern for the orphan and the widow. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes. They devour widows' houses. The poor widow who gives all, her whole means of living, stands in striking contrast to the scribes who take all, who devour widows' houses, that is, their means of living. The scribes seek to call attention to themselves. They like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. While the widow is so unobtrusive, hidden in the crowd, that only Jesus notices her. It's he who calls her action to the attention of the disciples. 2 weeks ago, Jesus was met by blind Bartimaeus along the way. When this blind beggar is called by Jesus, he cast away his cloak, his most precious belonging, and after being healed, he followed Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. The widow in the gospel is silent. She says nothing, and yet her actions speak volumes. The Greek word for her giving her whole life prefigures the sacrifice that Jesus is about to make. It's both a judgment on the temple cult that demanded giving and so impoverished the widow, and as a prelude to Christ giving his whole life through suffering and death on the cross. At the beginning of chapter 14 in Mark's Gospel, there's another woman who enters the scene. She's only present in Mark's Gospel. You might remember her from this year's Passion Proclamation. While Jesus was in Bethany, seated at table in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar, a very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. There was understandably some criticism. Why was this ointment wasted in this way? But the criticism, of course, is directed to Jesus, who is going to waste his life pouring out his love in the very same way. Jesus praises this woman of Bethany because although she spoke no words, she is announcing Jesus' saving death. Her action is a prophetic utterance. She has anointed Jesus' body beforehand, and Jesus declares, whenever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So we can see the widow in today's gospel as an icon of Jesus himself. Both the widow and Jesus offer their whole lives to God. And it's for this reason, perhaps, that there is no interaction between her and Jesus, and the good news need not be announced to her. Like the blind man, Bartimaeus, who sees and understands, this woman, too, is living the gospel. She is already doing what Jesus is about to do. So Jesus calls his disciples' attention to her and then departs the temple. There's nothing more to be taught. All that remains is for us to go and do likewise.